Hello everyone, Leah here. In today's painting, I thought we could play with our watercolors as we paint some fun, loose interpretation version of a dahlia flower. So what you guys are going to need to do is grab your favorite watercolors and some watercolor paper. You can do this in a sketchbook or on some loose sheet watercolor paper. I'm going to be working in my sketchbook. And the first thing that I want you guys to do is actually just to wet your paper, and we're going to do wet on wet for the first beginning half of this painting. It allows the paint to just kind of do its own thing and flow around and really help with that added fun and impressions of the flowers themselves. I will point out that this paper it dried so fast that I was actually pretty much working wet onto dry at some point, so my paint didn't flow as much as I would have preferred it to. You'll also note that I am working with a flat brush. That is pretty much what I'm going to be using throughout the entire painting until I start to get to be more fine detail oriented. So you guys can use whichever type of paintbrush that you would prefer to use. I just prefer to use these shaped paintbrushes. Also, let's take a second just to look at the shape of a dahlia and what they kind of look like when they're bunched together. As you can see from the reference photo, they have these huge open round shapes with a lot of tiny little petals. And when they're off to the side, like the one I'm painting right now, they still have the visibility of those little petals sticking out. So I'm going to put a mixture of the two in here. This stage of the painting really is just your base layer to have that highlighted space that provides a very light color, because what we're going to be doing is going back in once it's dried a little and do some more layers. So we just want to really just map out where we're going to put some stuff and lay down our flowers and have some of our greenery as well. And if your paint happens to be wet, still you can do your wet on wet and let the colors really just blend into them, because this is a loose interpretation, right? We're not going to be doing hyper realistic watercolor flowers. We want it to be more abstract, and in order to do that, sometimes you just gotta have some fun and let your watercolor do its thing. Another way you can do that is with what I like to call the squiggle technique, and that's when you just move your wrist around and the paintbrush itself on the paper to get a movement to the shapes that you're creating. So I typically do it most often when I'm doing my leaves so that they don't look like, the typical shape. I'm not going hyper realistic with it. And I just want to point out right now, I'm trying to put in a darker center to the flowers, because when you look at dahlias, they do have a different color in the center of them. They can be a little bit more green or a darker version of that color. However, I will also point out that when I did that, it didn't really work out as much as I wanted to. Things happen when we paint. Sometimes the colors blend too well. Sometimes they don't layer really nice. Those things can happen, and it can happen to any of us. So I just wanted to, put a voice to that as well for you guys to see it. At this point, I am starting to put more layers into the flowers, and what I'm doing is really not focusing on exactly the shape of the petals, but kind of where the shadows might be and where I want those shapes to be. I'm playing with the size of the petals as well and how those shadows would be in the flowers. But one thing that I think is really important to note when doing this with dahlias is that they are very uniformed as a flower. So each petal is a circle, as you saw with the reference. Here, I'll pull up another one so you can see it. As you can see, there is uniformity. I feel like that word came out wrong. It's uniform, and they have a way of having all the petals work out and fan out together. But if you want to be really loose with it, you don't have to be precise with your actions. Let your wrist really just flow with its movement and move your paintbrush around too. One of the things that I really like about using flat brushes is the fact that when I move my paintbrush, I get multiple shapes and sizes. So I am able to get a flat, round, like a flatter, shape, but I can also get lines and angles. It's what really, I think, makes these brushes so fun to use. If you have one that you maybe have purchased in the past or came in a brush set, I recommend trying it out with these flowers. Play with it a little. See if it's something that could potentially be something you really like doing. For this layer of the flowers, when I'm starting to work on the shadows, what I've done for the colors itself, for mixing them, is that I just added more concentration. So I had less water when I mixed the colors to just make it a little bit deeper and darker. For the flowers that are, basically pointing away, so the center of them aren't facing the, I want to say facing the lens, but basically facing you, the viewer, we don't have to be too precise in the shape of those flowers, those petals, right? We want to actually have them be more of a broader stroke, so less detail oriented. One thing that I think really works for doing like loose interpretations with watercolors is having a mixture of your colors as well. So you don't have to make every single flower the same, color itself. You can have it a different variation of one, like this one here. It's a darker version of the yellow dahlia, but I am making it so it's more concentrated. I even mixed in some quinacridone gold to give it a bit of a richer tone to the colors as well. It just adds more layer and depth to the overall image. I'm going back to that first one that I started to paint and mixing in some of that darker color that I had from the dark dahlia, the one I was just painting, and I'm putting, and I actually mixed in a little bit more of a an orangey color to it, to give it a little bit of a darkness to it. I want my dahlias, instead of having a green center, to have a darker center. And I'm just going to put a little bit of that into these flowers. I'm going to focus on adding some more depth to the shadows and layering the colors. And if I have some spots that are still a little wet, I'm going to make sure that those colors get a little blended. So it's going to be wet on wet plus wet on dry technique as I go around and add some more shadow to these flowers. We're getting to the stage where I feel like you guys should really play with your own personal preferences. You might be making your petals really big or really, really small, or your layers, the colors that you're using could be mixed in with different color tones. Maybe you're not going to do your deep shadows as a darker version of the flower itself. Maybe you want them to be more on the purple side. So you're going to add in, you're going to mix a purple that's going to be complementary to something that you're using, or not even, well, I don't know if you want to go too complementary, because when you mix complementary colors, you get kind of a brownie color. So if you're going to do that, you might want to experiment with the colors in a notebook or on a test swatch sheet next to you, actually, before you lay it down. I did that too. I actually have my swatch book next to me while I'm painting this, so I can just double check that my colors are what they are going to be when I'm doing it. Right now, I'm focusing on just making my shadows kind of a darker version of the color of that flower. But I am thinking at this stage, I remember sitting here and thinking, okay, what I'm going to do is I think I'm going to add in shadows that aren't color related to this once I get closer to it. I want to pull in colors from one flower to another. So because I'm using pink for a couple of the flowers, I'm not going to use that same kind of pink and red tones into my yellow flowers, to just add some commonality between it, to tie it all together. Kind of think of it like the continuity of watching a TV show or a movie, how they keep the same color tones in the visuals along throughout the story. It becomes a part of the overall image. Maybe the sky is always this bright aqua-y color, and so they make sure they have that color throughout the scenes, even if you aren't really sitting outside, the actors aren't outside, they still have that same emotion through the color tones. So that's kind of like the same thing that I'm doing now. I'm creating the same color language throughout all of my flowers because I really like how this pink is popping on its own. But to me, it kind of was starting to stand out versus work with the overall image of the rest of the flowers. So I want to tie it in by putting it into my yellow flowers. You may have also noticed that throughout this painting, I really focus on starting in the center of the dahlias and work my way out. I'm doing this to make sure that I kind of keep a round shape, so the round circular way that the petals form. It's not, again, uniformed, but it is a way to help my brain make sure I don't veer off to the wrong shape. I think it really just helps keep concentrated on what I'm doing shape-wise to keep it circular. I would like to note that at this point of the painting process for myself, I started to notice that I have been spending way too much time painting the flowers themselves. When I'm painting my acrylic paints, I like to work on flower and then go to the greenery and then back to flower and then greenery, because it allows time in between for everything to dry a little so I can put my next layer down. But I've been working solely on just the flowers because this paper dries pretty fast, and so I've just been keeping up with doing it, and then all of a sudden I'm like, oh, I should probably start filling in this blank space, working on my greenery and the shapes that I want them in, because as I'm putting more details into the flowers themselves and these petals and being really loose with my interpretation of the dahlias, I'm feeling like the page, I actually took a step back and I looked at it and I was like, this page looks empty. Like there's something missing to it. And that's when my brain went, greenery. So now I'm actually going to work on some of the leaves. I'm just going to put random shapes and petals and just squish that greenery around a little and fill in some of this white space on the page. You can do this in different ways. You can go back in and re-wet the paper and do wet on wet again to get some of that same flow that you may have already gotten with your flowers from the first beginning of us laying everything down. But as you can see, mine didn't really do that. It didn't really expand because the paper dried so fast. So I decided to stick with just doing wet on dry and then layering on top of that damp greenery. Now that I've kind of mapped out where I want my green stuff to be and where the leaves are going to be, I ended up looking back at the flowers themselves and asked myself, what is missing from this painting? And if we want to have fun and play with it, we got to be a little bit more adventurous with doing something. So I mixed in a little bit of a greeny blue color to add to my shadows and started to lay it down on top of it. Now, something I want to note, as I mentioned earlier on when, say, potentially adding in like a purple shadow, you want to be careful with the colors that you layer on top because of how they might mix, especially if you're doing wet onto wet. But if you're layering a color onto a dry color, test it out first. Yellows and blues make greens. So because most of my flowers base color is a yellow tone, I'm getting a little bit of green in there when I'm doing my layering, but the blue is still a dominant shadow color. And I feel like it works for it, right? Like I think it actually kind of helps these flowers have a more playful appearance to them. And now that I've added that playful level to it, I'm going back to my greenery and just kind of squishing and swishing and squiggling in some shapes. I don't want it to be too realistic in the type of leaves it is. and I'm just going to put layer upon layer. I'm doing the same thing that I did for let's try that sentence again. I'm basically doing the same thing that I did for the flowers and the petals of the dahlias as I am for the greenery around it. I have a question for you guys. When you watch your YouTube videos with tutorials, do you prefer the tutorial just to be the artist speaking to you and letting you know what's going on? Or do you like to have some soft music in the background? Because I've done both types of videos, and I wasn't too sure what I wanted to do with this one now that I'm sitting down and editing it. I'm future Leah, but past Leah, when painting this, actually had 90s pop music playing while painting as I danced around the room and painted. So, when we're creating, we all have our personal preferences for having what our atmosphere is as we're creating. So what do you guys prefer the atmosphere to be when you're watching the tutorials? Do you like having music in the background that's maybe a soft undertone? Or do you prefer to just listen to the person speaking? I'm getting to that point in the painting where I'm starting to ask myself, does this need any more? And what does it need to make it feel complete to myself? And usually at that stage, it's just the finer details. And when I do those, I want to use a pointed brush, something that I can get fine lines with. And so I've switched over from using my flat brushes, and now I'm using a pointed 2 or 4 from the silver black velvet brush line. I like this bristle. I don't like the barrel. Is that the right word? The handle of the paintbrush. You can actually see that the black paint coating on the handle is slowly chipping off. So it's not too comfortable in the hand, but that's not the point of today's conversation. The point is I'm now just starting to put in some added details. This point of me mixing in a more concentrated color, more of a deep orangey red and things like that, I'm not focusing on really the shadows anymore. I now want to go back into my Dahlia and start painting shapes of petals. I want to be more, I'm trying to think of what the word is, more, I don't want to say playful, but I want to be, help me guys, what is the word I'm looking for? I want to add in layerage that has nothing to do with shadow, but more with shape. And I want to play around with what's happening with this flower. I want to bring out details and focal points for the eye to focus on. The center of these dahlias is where the petals are the smallest or more concentrated, and the further they span out, the bigger they get and the wider they become. So you'll notice that when I'm painting the centers, I'm basically just putting tiny little lines and squiggles and dots, and then I'm starting to move those little points out wider. And my dahlias are the small petaled version versus a large petal version, but I think it really works with that overall appearance that I'm trying to go with in the end. I also want to note that when you're at this stage and you're starting to put in your final details, continue to be playful with it. And keep in mind where your flowers are and what kind of flower shapes you have. When you look at my painting, you can tell that out of the 3 dahlias that are the yellow ones, one is clearly in the forefront, one is a little further back, and those colors that I mixed for them when I did the detailing reflect that and what I've done with it and with the layering. Same goes with the leaves. I am now adding in some shape with my favorite dagger brush and just being really loose with outlining the shape of the petals. I feel it's just the style in which I like to work in. You might want to be more bold in your brush strokes and have solid what's the word I'm looking for? Solid leaves. I feel like today is not the day to record, but I've been recording this on and off all day, and just to get it right. And I'm at the point, guys, where I'm just like, accidents happen. I'm human. Just gonna talk like I normally talk. So, yeah. So basically, I'm just going in and adding some of these fun final details. As we've reached that point in the painting with the final details, that means we've also reached that point in the video when we're starting to get to the end of it. So I want to say thank you to everyone for watching this. If you do want to let me know what your preference is for the type of tutorial videos you watch when it comes to there being music in the background or no music, feel free to do that in the comment section below. I'd love to hear your opinion on that matter. If you also have any just questions or comments, feel free to do that and I'll get back to you as soon as possible. If there is a certain type of flower or subject matter you want me to touch on to be a little bit more loose or anything like that, also share it in the comment section below and I'll do my best to actually create that content for you. If you liked this video, which I hope you did, please hit that thumbs up button and give it a like. It means so much to me to see you guys liking these videos, and yeah, thank you so much for watching it. If you haven't already subscribed to my channel and you're interested in using art as a tool towards healing and learning different techniques for creating things, hit that subscribe button because that's all that I'm here about. That's what I'm about here on YouTube. Now, before I sign off, I want to do a bit of a breathing exercise with you guys, and I want to use one of my affirmations for it. And today's affirmation is, I open up to the guidance of the universe, trusting that I am on the right path. So let's take a deep breath in and release that air and any negativity that we may be holding in. Let's focus in on the positivity as we think about our affirmation. So deep breath in again. Let out any negativity that we may have been holding on to. And let's shake out our limbs. Alrighty. Thank you so much. And until next time, stay magical.